We've got the Digital Summit we put on every year, either virtually or in person. We've kind of switched on and off with the pandemic. In that case, we try to go super heavy the other way, right? But maybe we should have more other vendors participate, just because people often love to come to things to learn what's new.
The last few years, there has been kind of a wide range. Like last year specifically, there was a lot of conversations around CDPs, like consumer database platforms.
When it comes to their marketing, he says it's more important to focus on your resonance.
There was one thing that I was thinking too on Digital's Summit is if we were to do something in person, if we were to like fly in some of our like key people that we wanted to have come in, like how would we justify that cost versus just having it virtual and like balancing that piece out? So there's definitely a lot of give and take when it comes to figuring out the balance of conference costs.
Okay, welcome to the Digital Dudes podcast. I'm David, and I am here with
Trevor Park, VP of Marketing at Digital.
Look at that. You got it right. Gold star.
Yeah. Gold star.
Yeah. Trevor, we are here with third co-host, Scarecrow.
Our chief scare officer.
Yeah. For those that don't watch on YouTube, Reed is on a spring break this week. And I think he took his girls to Vegas, which I think is really interesting. And I'll be interested to talk to him about it. But as we were setting up, I was like, Trevor's remote, and I was like, I don't want to rearrange the room. Should I just get one of the skeletons or whatever? In this case, a scarecrow from downstairs. And Trevor's like, absolutely. So we have a scarecrow that's joining me. Probably has actually, this scarecrow might have more personality than Reed has. So I think he's additive to the conversation.
It already is smiling, just a resting smiling face, which is
yeah. Careful, your face will freeze.
Margaret would be very happy about that.
Yeah, Margaret, our EOS implementer, would be very happy because she did give Reed feedback. She's like, Reed, try smiling more. So anyways, he's taking that to heart. But anyways, Trevor's here because we're going to talk about Social Media Summit. He and I just came back from Napa, where it was my first time at that summit, but Trevor's gone for many years. And Trevor thought it'd be good for us to just recap. And I will get this out of the way early, but we did do a freshman's perspective of AIM the first time we went to AIM. And then they who shall not be named got upset with our top 10 list afterwards. And well, I think that's a good goal, Trevor. Let's see if we can get someone to be really upset about how we recap the summit.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. I think from my perspective, the way that the supplier partners and the sponsors interact with one another at Social Media Summit is a lot different than most other conferences. And just as like who can we piss off at this one? I think this would be a tough one because of how collaborative everyone is. Like we were engaging with a lot of people that I'd consider competitors to Digital at this conference in like a really positive way. And then we were talking about potential like referral opportunities that if you go to like an AIM or an NAA, like it's pretty standoffish. I feel like there's not a lot of like people wanting to cross over the picket lines. Yeah.
Well, let me be clear so that Dennis or Steve from AIM don't think I was talking about them. AIM was not upset about our coverage. It was another vendor that got upset about our coverage. In this case, you know who we can test. I actually got feedback from Tom from LCP 360. He was like, I have a bone to pick with you. You said something on a podcast of yours and I didn't like it. So Tom, come at me, bro. Like, actually, we are going to have their CTO on before too long. So
yeah, Tom doesn't want any of this smoke.
yeah, totally. Well, I totally agree with you. I think I'd had over the last few years, I'd have a lot of customers asking me if we'd be going to Social Media Conference, and we never had gone. Then when you joined us, you said, "Hey, this is a must do." So I was like, "Great, let's go." So we took just you and me this time to scope it out. You helped facilitate the lobster boil, which I thought was an awesome event. And then overall, though, I felt very collaborative. It felt very intimate. You told me that this is a more intimate conference than AIM, and I struggled to understand how that was going to be before we got there. But once I got there, it's the venue and the way that the venue is designed that, to me, makes it more intimate than AIM. And I was already really excited about AIM and how intimate it feels because I feel like they do a great job of making it not just like you're hawking your wares, but way more conversation and networking. And Social Media Summit just had that in spades.
Awesome. I love that. From it being your first time there, like what would you say is kind of like the balance you felt? Because I think that's one thing that people always talk about the conferences just being so supplier heavy. I feel like while obviously it's going to be impossible to not be less than 50-50, I feel like there's still a good ratio that can be met. How close do you think they are to that golden ratio?
I like that question. I was taught back in the day, I'll get your live feedback on this, Trevor. As I say, we like to learn in public. I was always told not to say that's a good question, because the person that told me this said it makes every other question think it seemed like it was a bad question because I don't say good question. So what's your take on this? Because I did like that question, but I don't want to make your other questions seem like they weren't good.
Yeah. Now that you had the caveat, I'm now questioning all of my other questions that you didn't have caveats with. No, I, I think, I think the response is more of like, all questions are good questions unless commented on, which makes them a better question. Obviously, there are great questions, but there's like varying degrees. Like, you know how like your 0 to 10 scale, like your 5 is an average, and like your 5 is like you're good. I would say if you comment that it's a good question, you're probably pushing like a 6, 7. And then if it's a bad question, obviously it's under the 5, and like that's also where I think we don't do enough of a job of calling people out on of like that question sucked. Like why even ask that? And so I think that's also where we need to be a little bit more transparent in our feedback. So yeah, I would say I'm not taking it as a slight against my other questions. I keep them all as a 5 unless told otherwise. But I would take that one as a 6, 7. So I appreciate that.
Good recap. I appreciate it. So golden ratio of attendees to vendors, it did feel like it was probably a 50-50 split. However, in my experience, I don't know how the property management folks feel, because I was when I jumped on the bus to go to the lobster boil that you planned, I was sitting next to a few folks, and at first I was the only vendor on the bus, and I just was like, "Hey, look, they're like, oh, who are you with?" I'm like, "Well, I'm one of the sharks here," and they looked at me cross-eyed, and I was like, "Well, I just mean like." When I was on the other side and there would be a vendor with me, meaning not on the property management side, but at other companies, it felt as if, you were the lamb going to slaughter with the, and so I always joke about that with property management people, because I've wondered if that's their experience, where they're kind of like, I want to keep my distance. You kind of see that at AIM, right? When you're like, you notice people walking down not AIM, NAA, you see people walking down the aisle, and they're kind of like, they try to like do wide berths, the biggest distance between people, so they don't get like gobbled up. So anyways, I don't think that was the experience of property management people here, but I wasn't, I'm not one of them. But in my experience, I witnessed less what appeared like aggressive sales techniques from the vendors at this conference versus other conferences. And in fact, I had the opposite reaction. I actually witnessed a lot of vendors that would be talking to somebody and say, "Oh, have you met so-and-so? I think they would be worth talking to for you." And that made me feel really warm and cozy. For those that have been listening for a long time, they know a big effort of ours is trying to help the industry be more collaborative. And I was feeling way more collaboration at this conference. Not because of Digital, just because that's how vendors were treating it. So that excited me and made it feel good. And then, yeah, but as far as the golden ratio, I guess I'd be curious to get your take. Like, you've been in the event space for a while. You've worked on both sides of the aisle. What's your take? What do you think is the golden ratio?
Yeah, I think my first social media summit was 7 years ago, which is, I think, 2 years in, maybe 3 years into my stint in multifamily. And the first conference I went to ever within multifamily was AIM, and that was like 9.5 years ago. And that one I felt so, and like no slight to Dennis, because like I think he organizes it very well to like make sure that you have space to go enjoy the sessions. But I think one of the things that was difficult about that one is that was back when like he didn't have ground rules as to how suppliers could engage with operators and like kind of create a little bit more of a buffer of like I think what he says when he sends out the guest list, he's like, be cool. Like don't swamp them. And it took a little bit for people to get a hang of that over like probably a couple of years, but he was very good about like slapping people on the hand and being like, "Hey, I'm hearing complaints about you. Don't keep doing it, or we won't send you the list." And prior to that, I felt like I was lamb to slaughter. Like I wasn't even any big fish or anything for people to go after, but they like, my email inbox completely filled up like the week before AIM, and it was tough. Whereas coming to Social Media Summit, I think it was like 2 inquiries through account reviews, and I was having an account review with Reach Local and I think either Zumper or Apartment List or something, and they just like casually thrown out of like, hey, we're going to do this thing. Like, do you want to come in a day early and join us with it? And that was how the invite happened. It wasn't like this like big sequence marketing play that people did. And I feel like that happens a lot with the way that people outreach for this conference, specifically because like everybody is pretty much at this hotel. There's like one other hotel that's in the area that people can stay at. And that's kind of the gist of like, where people are going to be. And like, that's really helpful as well, because you're going to bump into them at some point. Whereas like the other ones, that there's such a large event that you're never guaranteed to actually see anybody or get that FaceTime. So for me, the golden ratio is probably more of like a 50-50 split. If I had to design my own conference, I would say it would probably be more of like a 1 rep to 3 operators, or maybe 4 operators. So probably more of like a 25 split. But that's like that's the ultimate ideal setup. And that's kind of how I like to run like our events, is that for every 1 rep that comes to an event, we have 3 to 4 operators on that side, so that it's more balanced that way. So like our lobster boil, that was almost 100 people, and we only had 22 reps at that.
So you would have been like 1/3, 2/3 reps but then it was oversubscribed. So you had more people show than what had RSVP'd. So that gave you that 25%. Yeah, interesting. What I'd love to unpack this just a smidge more. What when I talk to property management people, when I ask them, hey, what are you here for? They almost always tell me to meet with vendors and see what's new. That's kind of like their default answer. And I'm like, oh, okay, cool. What type of vendor? What kind of solution you're looking for? Sometimes they'll be like, hey, I'm really websites or something. I'm looking for a new one. It's like, okay, cool. But other times they're like, I just want to see what's new. It's fascinating to me, because that to me indicates that this industry doesn't have there's not like a good digital search way about it, right? That's what Revise is trying to help solve, is that you could do online discovery on a platform. But for the most part, the industry says they come to conferences to try to learn what's new. Is that so? In that case, from that spot, it almost seems like if you had too few vendors, that it would be disappointing, the management folks, because they'd be like, well, shoot, there's only 6 people to talk to, and I came here to really see what's up.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point to think about, because I don't know if I would attend a conference that was just session focused. I think it would be tough to think about, because if it was just like my peers talking about like their practices and what they're doing, I would want to make sure that it's like very relevant to my portfolio type. So if I'm a Class A operator that deals just in garden style in the Midwest, and I'm going to a conference that's just property managers, I would just want to see people that are talking about properties in the Midwest. I probably wouldn't want to see what's going on in the East Coast, because of how different it is from a market. So yeah, I think there always has to be that vendor presence. And I do agree that being able to see what's out there and what am I missing also helps kind of people get better awareness. Yeah, that's a good point. The last couple of people I talked to, I'm like, what brings you to Social Media Summit? And the primary answer was to see what operators I don't know about, or what vendors I don't know about.
So just interesting food for thought. Obviously, we've got the Digital Summit we put on every year, either virtually or in person. We've kind of switched on and off with the pandemic. In that case, we try to go super heavy the other way, right? But to this discussion, maybe we should have more other vendors participate, just because people often love to come to things to learn what's new. So as it's always interesting to learn. But overall, I thought they did a good job. And what the folks that should come to Social Media Summit would be those that are looking to have more substantial conversations with fewer people. So since it's not a huge conference, there's fewer folks there. When you do meet with the vendors, you're typically meeting with someone that's either one of the executives or pretty high up and pretty good influence in the industry, because you don't find, there's not companies sending 10 people to the summit. They're only sending a couple. So they tend to send some of their more experienced folks there. So that'll let you have a little bit deeper conversation. And then it doesn't feel too, well, I guess I should back up. On the content side of things, I thought it was interesting because I was expecting to go and have every session be about, here's how you make a good social post. But that's not the case. It's still pretty wide ranging. Like they had a Google representative there, which obviously didn't immediately click for me about social media. They had other types of speakers there that weren't just social media related. Even like I think it was one of the keynotes was on branding. And so I just thought it was interesting and a little bit of a pickle, like meaning, should they change the name to be more broad since the content was not all social media? Should it be a more broad title? But now you're stuck with, I guess, the name Social Media Summit.
I asked that to Andrew actually, because the last few years there has been kind of a wide range. Like last year specifically, there was a lot of conversations around CDPs, like consumer database platforms or whatever they're called, and like how people are storing their customer data. And that can provide better personas and segmentation of your marketing efforts and all of that fun stuff. But in some degree, it doesn't necessarily apply directly to social media, but more of like the overarching strategy of just digital marketing as a whole. And so, yeah, I brought that up and he's like, well, it'd be too hard to change the name now, I think is what he said. And so I think that's also just kind of going with the understanding that this summit, and maybe it's a brand perspective of like, this needs to be more digital focused, and we need to promote that this is not just social media, but there's a lot of digital marketing around it. There were some good conversations around AI. There was a lot of persona talks about Gen Z and millennials and how that shift is happening, like how that marketing shift has been happening a lot in the student front. So yeah, I think whoever's doing their marketing strategy should definitely promote that it's not just social, because I think they'll definitely expand their awareness.
Yeah, tough. I mean, I know even Dennis at AIM and Steve, I don't know who made the call, but wasn't it originally the Apartment Internet Marketing Conference, and then they changed it to Apartment Interactive Marketing? Like, it seems like all of these conferences, like at some point, are faced with this decision of, what should you do with the name? And so I've not had to come up with a conference name. Therefore, easy for me to sit on the sidelines, but it just seems tough.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think, it's Apartment Innovation, I think.
Oh, Innovation. Sorry.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. They have the benefit of just being known AIM. They're so well ingrained in the industry now. They're just AIM, and nobody really would get the answer right. All right. Well, what else do you want to make sure we hit?
I want to talk a little bit on sessions. Like, did you pop into any sessions while you were there? And if so, did any stand out to you? Like anything that you wanted to highlight? There was one that I thought with Delaney Duke and I might butcher her name, Jessica Mancuso. They talked specifically on Gen Z, which I thought was super interesting because they both are on the student housing side. So I feel like they're frontline for defense for this persona and demographic shift that's happening. So they had some really interesting takes on it.
Yeah, I didn't do as many sessions as I would have thought, which is more of a, I guess, a testament to how you can have so many good conversations. Because it wasn't like I don't drink, so I wasn't out wine tasting. But I was there, and I was always like engaged with someone. So I made it to the keynote with the branding, which I thought was really good. And then the other one I wanted to make it to, but someone named Trevor booked me for a podcast interview, so I didn't get to. Was the AI session, which is interesting because a lot of times I shy away from those sizzle, or what feels like a sizzle buzzword type of thing. But I was excited about what I liked is they seemed to limit how many sessions on AI that they were offering, which to me meant that they weren't just leaning into it. So I was excited to see what they were going to offer or what the content was going to be there. But the branding one I thought was good, and my understanding is that, he's an author and he's been there several times, and so he's been well received. But I liked some of his points. Like he was basically, I'm going to get his exact wording wrong, but he was like, a lot of folks focus on reach when it comes to their marketing, and he says it's more important to focus on your resonance. So he's like, you'd rather have 10 passionate followers or loyalists or what have you versus 100 people that just see your message and move on. He just made his whole case about how important resonance versus reach was, and I totally believe that. It's actually similar to this podcast. Like Reed and I started this not to reach a ton of people. We don't expect to, but more of those that do follow hopefully resonate with what we're saying. So maybe I'm just enjoying him because I agree and he's reinforcing a lot of our strategy. But it seems like a lot of people seem to took some valuable notes there, and I saw a lot of head nodding and people afterwards saying, "Yeah, I need to think more about that. I'm kind of going super general with my marketing. I'm not really trying as hard to connect, and I need to rethink things."
Yeah, I think that's a good point. One thing that reminded me too of, I almost wish, and I've noticed this on the last couple of keynotes that I've sat in on, is that it would be nice to have the keynote session and then have another session that could potentially tie into that. Because I think what he talked on of like how we should focus more on the quality of engagement versus the breadth, like the reach of everything. But then it goes into like, well, how do you actually report on that? What's the ROI in there? Like, how do you actually see the impact on that? Like, how does your reporting structure change? And so thinking about like engagement rate and how that breaks down could be an interesting session to tie into something like that, to kind of further like give people action items to go back to. Because I feel like that is such a great like jumping point for a lot of people that might not be focused in that, but then it doesn't really necessarily give them the checklist or the action items that they need to go back to. It's more so they would go back to their stakeholders and say, hey, we're done focusing on reach and impressions, and we're now focusing on engagement rate. And then your stakeholder says, cool, how do we do that? And they're like, well, let me figure that piece out. But like having something that could like tie into that further could be really interesting. Because I agree. I think he hit the nail on the head with that one, that we definitely need to be focused on engagement rate versus impressions. But it didn't give me much in terms of the way of like, well, am I doing things wrong? Because that's initially how I'm thinking of things. How is everybody else actually tracking that's finding success in that category? And that's where I started doing deeper dives separately.
Yeah, it's I like your point, and it's nice food for thought for some of those some folks that run conferences. Is how could you incorporate more workshops into the time? Because I was in another session. I think it was actually that session. And when he ended, they opened it up for questions for like 10 minutes, and they were exactly 0 questions. Like nobody commented on anything. And I was surprised. And it's not because they weren't resonating. It was a packed house. It did feel like he connected with them, but people almost, I mean, on one hand, I was like, shoot, did he just do such a darn good job that no one has questions? But I think that would have been great discussion, is like, okay, let's take 15 minutes to workshop. Even if you pulled someone up from the audience, right, to do it, to at least give examples, because he's not that author, he's not dedicated to this industry, right? So maybe it's not on him to prescribe those things, but he could do a live workshop to give people ideas.
Well, I also think there's something to be said about, I can't remember who had pointed it out to me. They're director of social media for a student housing group, and they were asked to present on a topic a couple of years ago, and they keep saying no, but they keep wanting to, like, they want to do some like blog articles. And the way that they put it is like, I'm a keyboard warrior. I love engaging with people on social. It's my way of how I can communicate. I can't communicate with people in public. So maybe even opening up that Q&A session to like an online forum where people can type in their questions, or they can Slack or text their questions to make it more open that way. Because I totally agree. I thought it was surprising with how engaged they were throughout the entire keynote, that there was just kind of crickets at the end for the questions. And I'm like, I know people have questions, but maybe they just need to digest a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I like your idea of workshopping. I could get a lot of value out of that. I mean, when we go to conferences that are outside this industry and they allow workshop, it really helps me to reinforce, the learning or the takeaways from it, and to be able to discuss it. I do wonder, like, since you've put on events before, this is another aside, but most of these events don't charge, or they often gift a lot of tickets away, right?
Yeah, I don't know about Social Media Summit, but I know like AIM, we have we get with our sponsorship, we get a selection of VIP passes that we can give away.
Yeah, because I would imagine in this industry, you definitely need to support the economics of the conference to put it on. It's not inexpensive. So you need help with sponsors. But then if you had very few people, if you had 25 people show up on the other side because you were charging for the tickets, for example, then you're not going to have a lot of sponsors follow up the next year, right? So I could see a challenge with trying to balance that. And I don't know. I was just thinking through that point of your golden rule and how do you attract you. Maybe you then have to charge more for sponsorships to make up for the cost of the event versus if you were trying to collect money from people. Like you said, I don't know what Social Media Summit does, but I know many of the other conferences comp a lot of tickets, which as a vendor, I'm totally fine with, right? You want healthy representation from both sides. And there are a lot of conferences in this space, so you can't go to everything. And so if you were starting to charge the property management folks, it puts up a barrier that may mean that they don't come. So I was just wondering if you had more information on that. Sounds like, not a strong opinion.
No, I don't, but I do know that there are a lot of the conferences offer scholarships. So Apartmentalize offers scholarships for first-time attendees to the conference, and there's also a couple different programs that they have that will get you either free admission to the conference or a way to seek out sponsorship or comping for the tickets. AIM, similar thing with their VIP tickets and such. But I think too of MME, which is the conference in Baltimore that's kicking off for the first time, that one, the cost of the sponsorship is almost double Social Media Summit, but the vendor ratio is about probably a half. Or the number of vendors that are showing up are probably even less than that. And so I think that's also where the trade-off is, like you said, of too few sponsors. You have to increase the sponsorship amount to cover the overhead of the entire conference, and also to try and make it as low lift as possible for the conference attendees to show up, because they have travel and lodging that they typically have to pay for themselves. It was one thing that I was thinking too on Digital's summit is if we were to do something in person, if we were to fly in some of our key people that we wanted to have come in, how would we justify that cost versus just having it virtual and balancing that piece out? So there's definitely a lot of give and take when it comes to figuring out the balance of conference costs. I also think that conferences need to publish their budgets. That part would also be very nice, almost like a nonprofit.
What do you think is fair for a conference to profit percentage wise?
I mean, it really breaks down. When I think about Social Media Summit, the staffing is so low on that. It's Andrew, Luba are the two main people of that event. And then I think there's probably 3 or 4 more that are tied to it. So a total of 5 people that are putting that on. And if we say the lowest sponsorship that people can get for that is, I think 7 or 8. And there were probably 30 sponsors this year. So that's 210,000 that probably netted from that, not including the actual registrations. I don't know. If you say 10%, then you're only looking at a $20,000 revenue. So I think that's a tough breakdown. I don't know what that would also look like, because knowing, it depends on how many conferences they're putting on too. So Andrew, I think he has 3 other conferences that he helps put together. But then Dennis, I think Dennis only has the one conference. And so how do you balance that out?
They have what was MTech. I think they may have changed the name of that. And then they had a third one. So they had a few others. The AIM crew did, but AIM is definitely their flagship. I don't know Steven, but Steven, if you're now ticked off at Trevor, he won the podcast game. But you can take it up with him. I don't want your email.
I know. I feel bad. I finally got on Steve's good side. It took me the longest time. I had a LinkedIn request to connect with him that had been sitting for 8 years. And it was, I think on that 8th year, he finally came up and reintroduced himself to me and shook my hand. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm excited to officially meet you. I've been wanting to talk with you for a number of years to figure out how I can get a session in AIM. And he's just oh, you should send me a LinkedIn invite. And I'm like, I did 8 years ago. And he's like, oh, I'll add it. And so he finally befriended me. To the point where I can now text him and we're friendly. So hopefully that doesn't end.
Yeah. Well, I don't know what we can share without getting too many people ticked off about sponsorship rates, but you're right. Like sponsorships at most conferences, you're going to spend more than $10,000. Plus you have your travel and your swag. So it adds up quickly. At Digital Summit last year, we spent over $100,000 to put that on. So, and that was a smaller conference than what many of the other, even this one had more attendees. So it just gets really expensive, and I don't mind sharing that because I think many of the folks that are not on the vendor side don't know the costs of some of these things and what they go into. And then we are hit up every month. We have some client putting on some sort of conference, and they ask us to sponsor that too. And then they're asking us for anywhere from $5,000 to $50,000 for our client events. And so it gets really hard to know how you want to support your clients, but at the same time, like, yeah, you're not that profitable on a client to spend $25,000 often. At least on our side, like the margins are so thin. So I just find it a really interesting problem, and many folks don't know everything that goes into it. And when I turn them down, I feel like they are like offended. And I'm like, that would mean I'm upside down all year to sponsor your conference, Mrs. Customer, and I can't do this at a loss.
I think the perspective also, and this is probably where we piss off the operator side, but I think there needs to be more professionalism in the ask. So one of the things that I learned when I worked at nonprofits is that when we would go to a company to ask them for money, we would tailor our ask based off of our involvement with that company. And that's where I came up with my 3 to 5% rule. So I would look at how much money I'm spending with, let's say HubSpot. If we were asking HubSpot for money, I'd look at how much money we're spending with them annually. And then I would take 3 to 5% of that. And I would say, okay, this is the amount of money that I feel is realistic for them to spend on me to keep me happy and keeping that business their way. And that goes into like if you were looking at like CAC, like cost of customer acquisition, like that kind of stuff. I think there's definitely stuff to be said for. The same on the operator side, that if I'm hosting my leadership summit for the year and it's going to cost me X amount of dollars, and I want to ask everybody for this blanket, like, here are all my levels of 50K and above. And I ask somebody that I have a pilot going with, and the starting level is 50K. That to me would be like almost insulting as that relationship would go versus like thoughtful, and like it wouldn't show that they would want to continue to do business with me because they weren't thinking about that piece. But if they were to say, hey, we're looking at signing on an additional 100 properties and it will get us to a point where like the threshold's met and everything, and this would be a great opportunity for you to help roll that out. So let's bring you to this. Here's the cost that we would think would be appropriate. Like if they tailored those sponsorships a little bit more to those operators or the supplier partners, I think would be a more thoughtful way to do it.
I like this idea. I actually had the same thing from Dennis from AIM. He told me to like use 1%, but either way, I like your 3 to 5, and I'm going to use that for my birthday party. So everyone from Digital that I invite, 3 to 5% of their annual comp for my birthday. That sounds reasonable.
Totally. And and we expense that back, right?
Wait, hold on. Hang on. You almost tricked me there. That was close. That was a close call. I almost bit.
We'll talk. I'll talk with Ryan about it, and we'll get it. We'll get it on the books for next year.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, for the customer, I like that you were thoughtful when you were on the operator side. For me, my experience is, I don't know if they just don't want to invite me and they wait till the end and they're like, we have this thing coming up in 3 weeks. Could you please sponsor? And I'm like, wait a second. Like, I've planned my year. So it would definitely be helpful on the operator side if they give us more, even frankly, the year in advance, right? Like, everyone's got budgets. And for me to really be supportive of you, I don't want to be like trying to scrounge to find some dollars to support your leadership conference. So why don't you let me know a year in advance and say, I don't know when this conference is happening next year, but could you please earmark whatever, about 10K or something, just so, I mean, that would make you feel better, right? If you're on the operator side and you know in advance, like, Digital, I know that they're earmarking at least 10K, so I can count on them, versus they're probably scrambling at the last moment to try to find, folks in those last 6 weeks. And that's why I'm getting these emails.
Yeah. I'm going to bookmark that for a conversation with you, Nicole, Karina, and I. So maybe that's something that we incorporate with our talk tracks, with our like annual reviews with all of our clients, to say, hey, we know you guys had a conference this year. You guys had something. We didn't go to it, but we want to plan on going to it next year. What would be a typical budget dollar amount that we should plan on? And like, we could probably be on the proactive side for requesting that. I like that a lot.
Yeah. Well, good thought. Okay. Well, I know we need to get out of here for this week, but Trevor, thank you for pulling me into this event and having me go. It was really impressive to see you work an event. It was my first time experiencing it with you, and also to see you do the lobster boil. I was just blown away by what I felt was so successful about that event. And I had a heck of a fun time just trying to figure out how to open. Even this morning, I was like, what do you call it? Cracking a lobster is what you told me. Yeah, I didn't even know what it was called, but I enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you doing it. And I'm looking forward to the next one. RecCon's going to be a new experience for you as well, I think, right?
RecCon will be new for me, which, talk about branding. I had people there telling me, hey, am I going to see you in New York for RentCon? And I was like, oh, did Trevor typo this email? I thought it was RET-Con. And they're like, no, it's
Am
RentCon.
I saying it wrong?
No, you're right. You're right. I checked this morning because I got nervous. You are correct. I'm just saying, I see how people fall into the trap of thinking it's RentCon. But anyways, I'm very excited for that in New York too. So it's going to be a fun conference season, and we'll report back on what we think is interesting for anybody that happens to tune into this. Mr. Scarecrow, thank you for sharing your joy with us here today. You're as fun as a barrel of monkeys.